So when I was coming up as a young artist, I remember going to some of my first foundations classes in art school. And one of the classic projects was to sit down and make a bunch of color chips, right? So you'd sit down with paint and you'd mix your paint together and you'd work through the different tints, tones, and shades of different colors and manufacture what were effectively paint chips, like the kind of samples you get at Home Depot. And then I remember at my first faculty meeting have this really long and drawn out discussion, this argument with my colleagues about whether or not color theory could be taught on the computer. And while I admit that it can be a little confusing to start, the computer is a great place to learn about color because it runs it all through a mathematical formula. So it's very reproducible and it's very heavily articulated, but it does take a little bit to get used to, especially because it changes in some cases the way that you're used to counting. So here we are in W3 schools. See that the colors section is just absolutely enormous, right? So we're under the home, and we can see that when it comes to CSS and HTML, one of the things you can do is to set colors by name, although that's pretty limiting. So you effectively have access to the rainbow colors and maybe a couple tints and shades on either side. But for the most part, these are just like the super basic colors that a kid might draw with crayons or something. Now, if we take a look at CSS color values, we can see in addition to names, we can identify RGB, hexadecimal, HSL, and HWB values. This is a lot of different ways to think about color. So RGB you've probably heard of before, red, green, blue. And because of the way that computers count, there's different amounts of space we can give to a particular variable. So let's say, for example, I told the computer that there were only two different kinds of red that we could work with, two different kinds of green, and two different kinds of blue. That would be a sort of binary way of thinking about it, right? So there's either red mixed into our color or not. But in this case, because we want access to a larger range of colors, we have from 0 to 255 or 256 different options to talk about how red a particular color is, and the same amount of space, 256 for greens and for blues. So that might not seem like too much, right? 256, but it's 256 times 256 times 256, which gives you something around 16.5 million colors. Okay, so mixing together RGBs actually gets you quite a bit. Here, for example, instead of just letting this be red, which is 25500, let's say we change it just to 50, 50, and 200, and then we run that, and then we can see how the color changes, right? So it's a darker blue because it has a little bit of red and green in it, but most of the material is blue. 256 would be the most blue possible, or the most red, or whatever, and 0 would be none at all. Okay, so RGB is there, which you might find useful. You can also think about how, when it comes to making grayscale colors, if all the numbers are the same, you're going to wind up with some variation between white, black, and gray. So here's sort of a light gray expressed by 128, 128, 128. So you may also be asking, well, if I can get gray just by writing in the name, why would I go through writing out all these numbers? And sometimes it's nice to be able to identify a color very, very specifically, especially once you start getting into colors that aren't covered by the terminology where you're writing it out like a word. And hexadecimal happens to be one of my favorite places to work. So with hexadecimal, imagine that you're counting on your fingers, and your fingers represent, instead of 1 through 10, they represent 0 through 9. So there's still 10 fingers there, but you're starting to count at 0. Now imagine that you have, I think 6 more fingers. So once you get from 0 to 9, because it takes 2 fingers to count 10, a 1 and a 0, then we move over to letters. So it's almost like you're an alien that has 16 fingers, and after you count 0 through 9, you also then move on to A through F in order to get up to 16. So you can see that this works kind of like RGB. If 0 is where you start, meaning none of that material at all, and then F is all the way at the top, which is effectively 16, hex is a way that you can reproduce what we're doing in RGB, but with fewer characters. So FF0000 would represent red, and you can see right here what these numbers have in common with RGB, as the top value sort of rotates through the width of that numerical space. So I'll show you how this is applied in other programs. For example, so if we move over to Photoshop and we double click here on the color picker, you can see that I can set that color visually, right? So I can just pick something that I think looks good, but I can also see it referred to as hue, saturation, and brightness, as RGB, which we've just learned about. CMYK is more for the print environment, which is why we didn't see it show up in the web tutorial. And then down here at the bottom, what you may have thought of previously is just a random string of characters. That's our hexadecimal. So another reason I like to use hexadecimal is it's the easiest one to copy over from a space like Photoshop. And you don't have to open up Photoshop to do this. We can also go here on W3 Schools down to the color picker. And similarly, there's this interactive space where I can just click on things that look good. What can I do? I can look down here through the lighter and darker range. I could also use this really nice HTML5 color picker and so forth. So I get something looking exactly how I like it. And then once all that's done, I should be able to scroll down. Wow, look at this. Hue, saturation, brightness, etc., etc. So I see down here all the way at the bottom, it gave me a hex number. I would hope that would be up at the top somewhere, but maybe not. Ah, there it is right there. So now I can take that hex number, I can go back into Atom, and here I have my CSS page, my style, opened up. And instead of color red, I can say color number sign, and then paste in that hexadecimal amount, hit save, and then reload my page, and then I can see my heading inherit that color.